Somewhere right now, someone is lighting a cigarette, maybe on a porch, maybe on a quick break outside an office building, maybe in a car, window cracked, radio low. It is such a familiar sight that most of us do not even register it anymore. Just a small orange ember, a curl of smoke drifting up and disappearing, a habit so ordinary it fades into the background of everyday life. But here is a question almost nobody stops to actually ask. When did this start? And I do not mean the cigarette. That part's easy. Cigarettes are a fairly recent invention. I mean the deeper thing underneath it. The actual act of taking a plant and deliberately putting its smoke, or its extract, or its essence into your body, on purpose, for the effect it produces. When did a human being first do that? If you would asked an archaeologist this question 30 years ago, you would have gotten one answer. Ask again about 10 years ago, and the answer would have already moved further back than before. Ask today, and the number reaches so far into the past that it barely sounds like history anymore. It starts sounding like something closer to instinct. This is one of those weird topics where the science has not just been quietly refined over the decades, it has been completely blown open. Not once, but twice, by discoveries that force researchers to tear up what they thought they knew and start again. And each time it happened, the timeline did not creep backward by a few careful centuries. It leapt by thousands of years in a single afternoon of laboratory work. So let us actually trace this properly. Not the folklore, not the guesswork, but the real physical and chemical evidence, where it was found, who found it, and just how far back this strangely universal human habit really goes. Because the answer does not just predate the cigarette. It does not just predate written language, or farming, or cities, or anything we would normally think of as the start civilization. As you are about to see, it reaches back far enough to predate the end of the last ice age itself. And there is something else worth sitting with as we go. The same plant that shows up today on a warning label was for most of its history treated as something closer to medicine, or ceremony, or sacred tradition. That is not a contradiction. It is actually the whole story, how something goes from sacred to ordinary, and everything that happened along the way is exactly what we are about to dig into. Let us start with a story archaeologists believe for a long time, right up until the moment they did not. For years, the oldest solid, physical evidence of tobacco use in North America pointed to somewhere between 500 and 300 years before the Common Era, roughly 2,500 years ago. That was the accepted record. That was the number in the textbooks. Then, in 2018, a small limestone tube quietly rewrote it. The object itself had actually been sitting in storage for decades before anyone realized what it truly was. It was originally excavated back in the 1930s from a site along the Flint River in northern Alabama, a tributary that eventually feeds into the Tennessee River. Archaeologists at the time cataloged it, boxed it up alongside dozens of other artifacts, and moved on to other work. It was labeled, almost poetically given what we now know, a medicine tube. It was not until Doctor Stephen Carmody, an anthropologist at Troy University in Alabama, and his research team decided to test the object using modern chemistry, that anyone understood what they were actually holding. Working in partnership with the Eastern Band of Cherokee Indians Tribal Historic Preservation Office, the team ran a sensitive residue analysis on the material coating the inside of the tube. And they found something unmistakable. Nicotine. Not a faint trace. Not an ambiguous reading. A clear chemical signature, and one that really only comes from one plant, tobacco. Using animal bones that had been buried alongside the pipe, researchers were able to date the find to what is known as the Late Archaic period, somewhere between 1685 and 1530 BC. That works out to roughly 3,300 years ago, older than the fall of Troy, older than the reign of Tutankhamun in Egypt, and crucially, older than the previous confirmed record by close to 1,000 years. Carmody did not understate what the discovery meant. According to the report his team submitted, this pushed the presence of tobacco use in the southeastern United States back by nearly a millennium, and it forced archaeologists to reconsider assumptions about how early plant use, and possibly the very beginnings of agriculture in the region, actually seized bread. For a few years, this held the record, the oldest confirmed evidence anywhere on Earth of a human being intentionally using tobacco. 3,300 years old, sitting quietly in the museum drawer for most of the 20th century, simply waiting for someone to finally ask it the right chemical question. It would not hold that record for long. In 2021, the story changed again, and this time, the evidence did not come from a pipe at all. Out in the Great Salt Lake Desert of Utah, a research team had spent years slowly working through a site nicknamed the Wishbone Site. Today, it is a harsh, wind-scoured stretch of salt flats. But at the end of the last ice age, this same ground was something else entirely, a vast, sprawling wetland, rich with marshes, reeds, and migratory birds. Wind erosion had gradually been exposing the site over time, and archaeologist Daron Duke of the Far Western Anthropological Research Group led a team carefully excavating what remained. Around the remnants of an ancient fire pit, they found stone tools. They found the bones of ducks, almost certainly the leftovers of meals eaten by the hunter-gatherers, who once camped there, watching over that marsh thousands of years, before anyone had thought to build a permanent settlement anywhere on the continent. Picture that scene for a moment. Cold air, open water, birds calling across the reeds, a small group gathered around a fire at the edge of a marsh that no longer exists anywhere on Earth in that form. That is the setting this discovery came out of. Not a temple, not a village, just a hearth in the middle of nowhere at the tail end of the Ice Age. And mixed into the ash of that fire pit, they found something almost impossibly small, 4 charred seeds. The seeds belonged to a wild tobacco plant, known to science as Nicotiana attenuata. The seeds themselves were far too fragile and small to be dated directly, so researchers instead dated the burned wood found in the same fireplace. That gave them an age for the hearth of roughly 12,300 years old. Just sit with that number for a second. 12,300 years. That is not just older than the Alabama pipe, it is about 9,000 years older. This single find did not nudge the record backward. It dragged the entire known history of tobacco use out of the Bronze Age, out of the era of early farming villages, and planted it firmly in the last ice age, a time when much of North America was still recovering from retreating glaciers, long, long before anyone on the continent had planted it, cropped, fired a piece of pottery, or written down a single word. And here is the detail that makes this discovery feel less like a coincidence, and much more like a deliberate act. The Wishbone site sat inside a marsh. Wild tobacco does not grow in marshes. Based on where similar wild tobacco plants tend to grow even today, Duke's team believes the source plant was likely gathered from foothills or higher, drier ground, potentially more than 13 kilometers away from camp. Someone walked a genuinely significant distance, identified this specific plant among everything else growing out there, and carried it all the way back. It almost certainly was not gathered for fuel, either. Tobacco seeds, as it turns out, do not burn particularly well. A strange choice if all you wanted was kindling. Which leaves one explanation standing taller than the rest. This looks like a plant that was being deliberately used for what it does to the human body, not for warmth, and not by accident. According to the researchers themselves, this discovery did not just add a new data point. It replaced the Alabama pipe entirely, as the oldest known direct evidence of tobacco use anywhere in the world. Now here is where it is worth slowing down, because this is exactly the kind of moment where a story like this can quietly drift from solid science into pure speculation, if you are not careful. 4 charred seeds tell us, fairly convincingly, that people at the Wishbone site were handling and burning wild tobacco on purpose 12,300 years ago. What they do not tell us, not directly anyway, is exactly how that tobacco was being used. Were they smoking it, the way we picture smoking today? Possibly. But it is just as plausible that the plant was chewed, or sucked as a wad, or prepared in some completely different way, and only ended up in the fire afterward, whether by accident or as a deliberate act of disposal, once its use was finished. Seeds surviving inside a hearth prove exposure to fire. On their own, they do not prove that anyone was inhaling smoke through their mouth or nose. This distinction actually matters a lot if we want to tell this story honestly. Using tobacco and smoking tobacco are not automatically the same claim. and careful archaeologists keep that line clear rather than blurring it for the sake of a cleaner headline. The Alabama pipe is a bit more straightforward on this front. A pipe is a tool built specifically for inhaling smoke, so nicotine residue found inside one sits about as close to direct proof of smoking as archaeology can usually get. The Utah seeds are older, but murkier. They prove tobacco use. They strongly suggest, without fully confirming, that smoking specifically was involved. We do know that much later in history, long after this particular discovery, indigenous communities across North America used tobacco in a whole range of different ways. Smoked in pipes, yes, but also chewed into a thick paste, ground into snuff, or absorbed as a liquid. Some historical accounts describe hunters chewing tobaccos specifically to help push through hunger and fatigue during long treks. It is tempting to picture Ice Age hunter-gatherers shooting something similar 12,000 years earlier. But that is an educated guess wearing the costume of a fact for a fatter weird. There is no direct evidence yet connecting that later, well-documented practice back to the specific people who left seeds behind at Wishbone. What we can say with real confidence is this: 12,300 years ago, someone considered this plant valuable enough to travel for, valuable enough to carry back to camp, and valuable enough to use near their fire. Exactly what happened between the plant and their body after that, smoked, chewed, or something else, remains honestly an open question. And any version of this story that tells you otherwise with total certainty is skipping past that honesty for the sake of a cleaner narrative. So let us ask the obvious next question. If you are living through the tail end of the Ice Age, spending your days hunting, foraging, and simply trying to survive the season, why would you go out of your way, more than 13 kilometers out of your way, potentially, for this one particular plant? Wild tobacco is not food. It offers no real calories. In its raw form, it is genuinely unpleasant to consume and can be dangerous in large doses. So whatever motivated someone to seek it out, it clearly was not hunger. Researchers have floated a handful of different explanations here, and it is worth being upfront. None of them are proven. These are hypotheses, not settled conclusions. One idea centers on nicotine's physical effects. Nicotine is a stimulant. It can suppress appetite and mask fatigue, at least temporarily. Some researchers have speculated that early hunters emphasized tobacco, ways certain later cultures are known to have, as a tool to push through long stretches without food during an extended hunt or a difficult journey. It is a genuinely plausible theory. It is not, however, confirmed one, and there is no direct evidence from the Wishbone site itself that tells us this was a motivation. A second possibility points toward ritual or social use, rather than anything practical at all. Across the world, plants with strong psychoactive effects have often carried spiritual or ceremonial weight, sometimes long before, or entirely separate from, any everyday practical purpose. It is entirely possible this early tobacco use had more to do with altered states of awareness, shared experience around a fire, or ceremony, than with hunting logistics of any kind. There is also a more medicinal angle worth mentioning. Nicotine has mild antiseptic and insectipide properties, and many cultures throughout history have applied topically to wounds, to skin, to bites, not only by ingesting or inhaling it. Darren Duke, the archaeologist who led the Utah discovery, has raised an even broader possibility, one that stretches well beyond the single site. He has suggested that humanity's early relationship with intoxicating or mind-altering plants like tobacco may be tangled up with the much larger story of how humans eventually began deliberately cultivating plants at all. It is a bold claim, and it remains speculative. Duke himself has framed it as a possibility worth investigating, not a proven conclusion. But it is a reminder that tobacco's story might not be a small footnote in human history. It may sit closer to the roots of agriculture itself than most people would ever guess. The honest answer to why is that we do not fully know yet. And that is not really a weakness in this story. It might actually be the most interesting part of it. The physical evidence here is solid ground. The motive behind it is still being pieced together, one careful discovery at a time. Whatever the original motivation actually was, something about it clearly stuck. Over the many thousands of years that followed, tobacco did not fade out of the picture. It became deeply, permanently woven into the cultures of the Americas. By the time we reach the more recent archaeological record, the evidence shifts from scattered, occasional seeds towards something far more deliberate: purpose-built tools, pipes. Across eastern North America, archaeologists have recovered smoking pipes in large numbers, many of them found buried directly alongside human remains, a strong signal that these objects held real personal or spiritual significance for their owners, not just practical value. Out in the Pacific Northwest, researchers analyzing ancient pipes from the Columbia River Basin identified nicotine residue preserved inside stone pipe fragments dating back roughly 1,200 years, and in some cases, that nicotine showed up mixed with residue from other plants, including sumac, suggesting tobacco was sometimes deliberately blended with other ingredients rather than smoked entirely on its own. That detail matters more than it might seem. It tells us tobacco was not just being smoked casually, it was being prepared, blended, refined into something closer to a recipe than a raw plant simply plucked and lighted on the spot. Later ethnographic records describe similar smoking blends, sometimes called kinnikinnick, mixing tobacco with the inner bark of red osier dogwood, bearberry leaves, or other regional plants, a tradition documented across many different Native American and First Nations communities. That kind of careful preparation does not tend to happen with a substance people treat as an afterthought. It happens with something a culture has collectively decided actually matters. The language used around these objects backs this up too. Remember that Alabama pipe from earlier? The one Doctor Carmody's team tested? It was not originally labeled as a smoking tool by the archaeologists first cataloged it. It was labeled, decades before anyone knew its true age, a medicine tube. Working alongside Carmody's team, a representative from the Eastern Band of Cherokee Indians, a Rural Historic Preservation Office, noted that ritual and religion were a fundamental thread running through daily life in these ancient communities, and that tobacco sat close to the center of that world. Arguably one of the single most important plants to indigenous peoples across the continent. This same theme shows up again and again throughout the archaeological record of the Americas. In many later plains and woodland cultures, elaborately carved pipes, sometimes called calumets, were used specifically in diplomatic and treaty ceremonies between different groups. Smoke share as a gesture of peace and mutual trust. Tobacco does not look like a recreational habit people simply picked up out of boredom. For thousands of years, across community after community, it occupied a role much closer to the sacred, used in ceremonies, in healing practices, in moments of real spiritual weight, sometimes carried in what were literally called medicine bundles, collections of sacred objects kept and passed down within a family or a community, often open only for specific ceremonies or moments of real significance. By the time Europeans eventually arrived on the continent, tobacco was not some newly discovered curiosity. It was already ancient, already sacred to the people who used it, already woven tightly into the fabric of countless different cultures, each with its own relationship to the plant, built up over, as far as the evidence currently tells us, more than 12,000 years of continuous human history. Which brings us to the moment everything changed, once again. Not through archaeology this time, but through first contact. On October 12, 1492, Christopher Columbus and his crew landed on an island in the Bahamas that the local Taino people called Wanahani. Among the gifts the islanders offered these strange new arrivals were dried leaves, fragrant and familiar, and to the Europeans, completely mysterious. Not knowing what to make of them, the crew apparently just discarded them. They would not stay confused for long. About 3 weeks later, on November 2nd, two of Columbus's men, Rodrigo de Jerez and Luis de Torres, were sent ashore in Cuba as translators, still convinced they might be somewhere near the court of the Emperor of China. Instead, they encountered something entirely unexpected. They watched local people roll dried leaves inside wrappings of palm or corn leaf, light one end, and draw the smoke out through the other, an early, close relative of what we would now recognize as a cigar. Rodrigo de Jerez did not just watch. According to historical accounts, he tried it himself. And he apparently liked it enough to keep the habit going, all the way back across the Atlantic Ocean, home to his town of Ayamonte, in Spain. This is where the story takes a turn that sounds most too strange to be true. When Dayers casually lit it up back home, smoke curling from his mouth and nose in public, his neighbors reportedly panicked. Nobody in Europe had ever seen anything remotely like it before. The sight was so unfamiliar, so unsettling, that according to several historical accounts, the Spanish Inquisition had him arrested, the reasoning being, essentially, that only the devil himself could grant man the power to breathe out smoke. Some accounts describe him spending as long as 7 years in custody before finally being released. By the time he walked free, the world outside his prison cell had already moved on without him. His arrest had not stopped smoking from spreading. It kept spreading anyway, carried home by other sailors making the same voyages he had. Tobacco use took hold across Spain and Portugal, and it soon reached England as well, popularized at the Elizabethan court in the late 1570s, largely through the influence of Sir Walter Raleigh. Not everyone approved. England's own King James I was so opposed to the habit that in 1604 he published a pamphlet, initially anonymous, but clearly his own work, condemning tobacco in strikingly harsh terms, calling it loathsome to the eye, hateful to the nose, and dangerous to the lungs. He backed his words with action too, authorizing a steep new tax on imported tobacco that same year. It did not work. Demand kept climbing anyway, and tobacco cultivation soon became a cornerstone of England's colonial economy in Virginia. Opposition was not limited to England either. Several other European nations attempted outright bans on tobacco during the 1600s, and by most accounts, the Ottoman Sultan, Murad IV, went furthest of all, prohibiting smoking across his empire in 1633 and enforcing it with extreme severity. Meanwhile, in the 1560s, a French diplomat, Aimé Charnicot, helped popularize tobacco at the French royal court, promoting it as a supposed remedy for various ailments. His name is the reason the active chemical in tobacco is still called nicotine today. Within just a handful of decades, a plant that indigenous peoples in the Americas had already been growing, refining, nourishing, and treating as sacred for thousands upon thousands of years was suddenly rushing across an entire ocean into a completely different culture, one with none of the accumulated caution or context that had shaped its use for millennia beforehand. Once tobacco crossed the Atlantic, its story sped up dramatically, a sharp, almost jarring contrast to the 12,000 slow, quiet years that came before it. European colonists quickly realized tobacco was not just an interesting curiosity worth a passing mention in a letter home, it was profitable. Enormous plantations spread rapidly across the Americas, built specifically to grow tobacco as a cash crop for export, fueling an economic engine that went on to shape colonial history in ways that reached far beyond the plant itself. From European ports, that same trade network carried tobacco onward into Africa and across Asia within just a century or two of first contact, turning a plant that had belonged exclusively to the Americas for 12,000 years into one of the most widely grown and widely traded commodities on the entire planet. For roughly 2 centuries afterward, pipes and snuff, tobacco ground into a fine powder and inhaled through the nose, remained the dominant ways Europeans consumed it. Cigars did not really catch on widely till the early 1800s. And the cigarette, the form most closely associated with smoking today, is actually one of the newest chapters in this entire story. It did not become a mass-produced, mass-marketed product until a cigarette rolling machine, patented around 1880, made it possible to manufacture cigarettes by the thousands, and eventually the billions, instead of rolling them one at a time by hand. What had once been a plant tied to ceremony, medicine, and spiritual practice was, within the span of only a few centuries, fully repositioned as an industrial product, something bought, sold, advertised, and mass-consumed on a scale that no hunter-gatherer standing at the edge of that Ice Age marsh in Utah, and no craftsman carving that limestone medicine tube in ancient Alabama could ever have possibly imagined. It took until the middle of the 20th century for large-scale scientific research to firmly establish the health risks tied to regular tobacco smoking, risks that reshaped public health policy, advertising regulations, and personal habits across much of the world in the decades that followed. That modern chapter is really a story of its own, but it is worth noting here, because it marks the first time in 12,300 years that humans studied this plant using the tools of modern medicine rather than generations of trial, ritual, and observation. Today, tobacco use touches an enormous share of the global population. Current estimates put the number of tobacco users worldwide at well over a billion people. That number represents simply the current chapter of a much longer story, one that stretches back, as far as the evidence currently tells us, roughly 12,300 years into the past. So back to the original question, when did ancient humans start smoking? The honest answer is, we do not know exactly, and that is not a dodge. That is genuinely the current state of the science. What we do know is that every time researchers thought they would finally found a beginning, the ground shifted beneath them, and the true beginning turned out to be further back than anyone had previously imagined. First, the record stood at a few thousand years. Then a pipe from Alabama pushed it past 3,300. Then four tiny charred seeds, buried in a Utah desert that used to be a marsh, dragged the entire story back past 12,000 years into the last ice age itself, long before agriculture, before pottery, before writing, before almost everything we typically think of as the start of civilization. And maybe that is the real takeaway here. This was never really a story about one plant. It is a story about how far back some of our habits genuinely reach, how something as small and fleeting as a curl of smoke can connect a person alive right now, but hunter-gatherers standing around a fire at the edge of a vanished ice age wetland, separated by more than 12,000 years, and yet doing something recognizably, unmistakably similar. The record that stands today says 12,300 years. But if the last few decades of archaeology had taught us anything at all, it is that this number probably is not final. Somewhere out there in a hearth nobody has excavated yet, or in a drawer inside a museum collection, quietly waiting for someone to finally run the right test, the next discovery is probably already sitting there. We just have not found it yet, and if that changes the way you think about the next curl of smoke you happen to notice, good. That is the whole point of digging this deep into a question nobody usually thinks to ask. Let us start with the story archaeologists believe for a long time, right up until the moment they did not. Let me know in the comments what part of this timeline surprised you the most.